Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you, there's positive news regarding dementia and a shingles vaccine, although the relationship between the two is tenuous to say the least. A development in surgical anesthesia and the idea of keeping somebody effectively entirely awake and aware during kidney transplants, which may be considered a nightmare by some. The scientists find a new hormone that leads to significantly stronger bones. Genetically enhanced humans may be the only way we can actually achieve space travel. The Komodo dragon teeth have metal caps over them that keep them sharp forever. The ongoing saga of Sri Lanka and the attempt to go all organic, and the absolute shit show that became. Tesla plans to use humanoid robots in the near future. The academic culture of fraud and the unfortunate reality of it, and finally the incredibly poorly thought out plan of a terror plot for a Taylor Swift concert. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with, effectively shingles, but shingles leading on to dementia. The relationship between the two is weird. Now, it is entirely true that the virus responsible for shingles, a chickenpox virus, does live in neurons and therefore will come back if given the opportunity. This is why the elderly, particularly if they're stressed or unhealthy, are at risk of shingles. But that's the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system, which is where you find dementia. So how are the two related? Well, this is where it gets interesting. It's expected that the vaccine provides protection for about 5 years, and there's been a fairly widespread use of it so far. Although, in short, it's relatively limited since there's been a supersedence, let's say. Zostavax was the shingles vaccine used previously. Now they're using Shingrix, and the difference is relatively immaterial other than that they have changed vaccines, so be aware that some of the findings from the study may not necessarily translate because of it. The study looked at about 100,000 people. It was 103,837 who received the older vaccine between 2014 and 2017. They then compared individuals, roughly if not the same number, who received the new vaccine between 2017 and 2020. Now, they were able to use electronic health records, and effectively this means that you don't need to chase down every individual. All you have to do is keep an eye on what the record says, and you get notified if there's a change. Much easier than trying to do surveys or similar. The results roughly come down to the fact that getting the Shingrix vaccine led to a delay in diagnosis time. Now, this is not a bad thing, but, well, in short, it's not necessarily a major thing either. The delay is an average of 164 extra days without being diagnosed with dementia, but then again, a diagnosis is not necessarily a reliable measure. After all, it's hard to say if the diagnosis delay is down to the fact that, well, they just can't afford to go to a doctor. They don't have family who notice that their mind is slowly going away, or any number of other variables that haven't been accounted for by just looking at a vaccine. But if, and this is the big if, it is actually true that the vaccine provides this benefit, that would mean that there's a 17% increase in the delay in being diagnosed with dementia, which is a pretty massive thing when you consider how horrifying and nightmarish dementia can be. In other drug-related news, although no more exciting than that with the shingles vaccine, but possibly more interesting to some, a particular drug, and a fairly common drug for that, can extend the fertility window for women by a fairly big margin. Before getting excited, bear in mind 3 things. 1, this is very preliminary research. 2, well, even if it's preliminary, they may not actually find that they can do what they want to do because they're repurposing an existing drug. 3rd and finally, just bear in mind how many crotch goblins might come about as a result of this, and the realization that perhaps children weren't a great idea. Getting to the actual point of the findings though, it's an ongoing clinical trial claiming that Rapamycin, it's a drug used as a effectively used to help with organ transplants, let's say, and it generally tries to reduce the failure rate, could extend fertility by up to 5 years, which isn't a very large margin, but also considering the sheer number of women who are not only delaying having children, but in some cases need to rely on, let's say, external help, something like IVF for instance, in order to be able to have children. This could be a major boon. It's a lot cheaper to have this drug than it is IVF after all. The underlying mechanism is reasonably straightforward, if what's being put forward is true. That is, rapamycin has an effect on reducing the number of primordial follicles. That is, the follicles that will mature and get released during ovulation. By reducing the number of these follicles that are, let's say, wasted during that process, you can ensure that the reserve of these follicles remains higher for longer, effectively using them more efficiently. And that would explain what's happening. Possibly. Therein lies the crux of the problem. This study that we're talking about hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, so there's a lot of claims, but not a lot of assessment of its real validity. In more valid research, let's say, and certainly more nightmarish research, it's the future of kidney transplants and the intention to keep the donor and recipient awake during said surgery. Typically, this would be cause for a lawsuit and medical malpractice accusations. Sitting through being cut open, having an organ taken out of you, and then put into someone else should be the thing of nightmares, horror stories, and late-night television, and telling you about somebody who woke up in a bathtub.
Yeah! Goodbye, Charlie! Yeah, goodbye, Charlie!
Goodbye? What? Hey, what's going on here? Hello? Who is that? Oh, what happened? Oh, they took my freaking kidney!
Not good medical practice. Well, it actually is when you look at what's happening. What they're doing is providing a spinal block. That is, they block transmission of neurons in the spine, thereby preventing any feeling of sensation. Exactly the same thing that's done during pregnancy. It's called an epidural. The advantages are that because the individual is not under total anesthesia, not only are they awake and understanding what's going on, but they are also less likely to suffer adverse events. This is particularly important with the elderly, who, the older they get, the more dangerous it is to put them under complete anesthesia. Shifting to other drug-related news, but this time how it works rather than the reduced need for. It's watching opioids behave in real time and inside the brain. Opioids, depending on how you look at them, are a massive evil or a great deal of fun. Now, we're not going to judge you either way, but understand, opioids tend to be kind of addictive. And while we know something about them, particularly that they are addictive and that taking too much is bad for you, we don't know a lot about how they're actually working in the brain. Now, there are generally understood processes, that being they trigger feelings of happiness, and these end up leading to a net positive reinforcement loop. That is, the more you take them, the happier you feel, but you need to take more again to get to the same point, and so you always have to take more and more. This is why the opioid epidemic in America is leading to all sorts of trouble. More and more people need more and more drugs, and there's only so much out there, or only so much the body can cope with. This brings us to how you do it. It's very simple. You take mice, the blunt object of the research world, and you throw it at the problem. This time though, they modified the mice genetically, so that they expressed particular receptors with fluorescence compounds in them, that allowed them to visualize the activity of the opioid as it went to the receptor. When the opioid binds to the receptor, it causes a temporary fluorescence, let's say, and that fluorescence allows them to know that it's been activated. This means you can follow what's happening and where it's happening in the brain of these mice. Where this gets really useful is we're not just talking about exogenous opioids. That's basically your pills you take, inject, or otherwise consume. Rather, we're also talking about endogenous opioids. Now, this is a very big family of different possible ligands that can bind to the receptors. For example, endorphins. But it's not just endorphins, there are about 20 of them, if not more, that can all act on the opioid receptors in the brain, and there are 3 different receptors on top of this. So which of them, responding to which receptor and where, becomes really difficult. You're basically trying to track at least 60 different possible things that could be happening. That is each receptor and its 20 possible ligands. That's 3 types of receptors, 20 different opioids, and we don't know exactly which is doing what, where, and how, at least until now. And this is where things get to be a little bit clearer, or at least a little bit brighter, and that's because of that fluorescence compound. We know that the amount of fluorescence corresponds to the expression of the receptors. Therefore, by knowing which receptors have which particular light attached to them, let's say, the fluorescent compound, we know which ones have been activated by what, where, and to an extent, how much, although very preliminary. The benefit to this is that we can understand what different opioids are doing in the brain, and if you want to look at this, let's say, more skeptically, we can look at which of the opioids to make them more addictive. In other biological and medical related news, we have the idea of making our bones stronger, which is already desirable, particularly again with the elderly, where osteoporosis or weakening of the bones is a big concern. So what if we could make them stronger? Well, we do have one way at the moment, and that's estrogen. A small estrogen implant can provide several months' worth of extra protection that helps to strengthen the bones, which is good for women, less good for men because they generally have less need for it, and if they do get it, there are other complications. So what if we had a different hormone? Well, we do now, or at least we might have now. The researchers looked to their favorite animal, mice, and found that mice produce a particular hormone that not only leads to stronger but more dense bones, and this is fed to their developing pups, thereby allowing them to grow quicker and, well, better. Which is all well and good, except, well, mice, not really translating to humans. However, in theory, if we could translate it, this would be a huge breakthrough. The way they got here is actually kind of creative, and it's very much reminiscent of the problem we've just described, particularly with estrogen and bone development in humans. What they found was that if they blocked estrogen from parts of the mouse brain during the feeding stage, they actually got stronger bones, and that's because they were releasing this particular hormone. Now, the hormone is called the maternal brain hormone. It's also a protein called CCN3. The researchers found that if they were to get this maternal brain hormone to be active, they could double the bone mass of the female mice that were feeding, which is not what should normally happen. Normally it should be a loss of 30% of the bone mass. So that's a huge thing to start with. The second, and this is somewhat more useful again, is that if they gave it to both males and female mice, they both demonstrated an increase in bone mass and strength, meaning that if you could synthesize it and make it functional in humans, you would get something beneficial to both males and females, and you would avoid that issue of the, well, fundamental problem of relatively sex-specific hormones being used. And you might be able to make your own X-Men superhero. In a related bit of news, we have the idea of using robots in rehabilitation. Robots in rehabilitation is a worry, and it's mostly down to the fact that if you take a robot and you put a human inside of it, and the robot moves in a way the human is not meant to move, you will cause, at best, pain, and at worst, death, and possibly something in between. Therefore, robots in rehabilitation have been a somewhat questionable area until relatively recently, where they've had a slight boon. And that boon being that a massive meta-analysis and systematic review found that, yes, there is a benefit, but it is a small, significant benefit. To be clear, we're talking 1 or 2 or even maybe 3% improvement versus alternatives, so it's not a massive achievement. However, even a 1% improvement in some instances can be a huge thing for a patient, let alone slightly more. However, at that point we are talking about diminishing returns. 1 can be doubled to 2, but going from 2 to 3 you've now got a 50% improvement, and you can see how you get less and less the higher the number goes. Science-based medicine does also put forward 2 other points that are worth reiterating. One is that this frees up the human medical practitioners who would otherwise be providing the relatively repetitive exercises that would help somebody get very small incremental improvements. But because it's a robot, that practitioner can go and deal with somebody else who needs a, let's say, a more dynamic adjustment on the fly versus a robot who can just keep doing the same thing. On the other hand, these are very expensive robots, and because of this, the technology and the implementation is limited. And the cost of healthcare in America is, well, it would cost you a kidney, which is not good, particularly if you're already down one. The other issue is simply that, well, if you're only getting a small incremental improvement and it costs a lot, is it realistically viable, not only in the short term but the long term, to have this as an option and partial alternative to practitioners for rehabilitation? Going from rehabilitation to what will effectively be your superhumans, your Übermensch. It's the proposal that we would need to modify humans, and talking here about genetic engineering and modification, in order to be able to send them further afield than just the Moon and Mars. Basically, if they're going to try and wait for Starfield to be finished. And that'll probably occur about the same time we colonize Mars anyway. The issue is that many of the things we would need to do to be able to get to somewhere further afield, for example, the Earth-like planet in the habitable zone we mentioned last week, that's so far away that it would take 40 light years to get there. That's a long time, and that's assuming you can travel at the speed of light. Anyone you send today, assuming you send them fresh out of university, will probably get there at a time when they can now retire. If, however, you were to send them in a somewhat suspended form of animation, you would be able to get them there, and they would start work immediately. Although we now have to raise the question about the time in suspended animation. Does it count as work time, or does that not count as working? Because we want to know whether or not you can build up your various retirement requirements as you travel, because that would be a really good deal. The financial side of this aside for now, the problem is simple. If we want to do something like that, we would need to, say, put people into cryogenic sleep. We can't do that, or at least we can do that, but we can't wake them up, not successfully. Therefore, we would need to modify humans to be able to do so. For example, do we want to stick tardigrade DNA into them, so that their blood doesn't turn into crystals and destroy all their cells? Other issues would include things like bone density. Astronauts in space lose a lot of their bone density, and so when they return to Earth, they have to go through a fairly long period of rehabilitation, or else they risk all sorts of health issues. We also have the problem of radiation in space. It might surprise you to learn, but being in a metal tube in space is not all that safe in terms of radiation. There's still a fair amount of that cosmic power that gets through, and that will cause harm and damage to your DNA, even if you are in suspended animation, because that doesn't protect your DNA from being damaged. It just means you won't be expressing it, for now. That could also mean you're in for a very rude surprise when you wake up and find that you're growing a third arm, or a fourth leg. For now, this is mostly theory crafting, but theory crafting that we will eventually have to confront, more so than we have in the past with the CRISPR babies and the shit show that was in China. Shifting to animals now, other than the water bear, we have a rare lobster. Now, this lobster is not the famous or infamous, depending on how you want to look at it, idea of a lobster being able to live forever. Or rather, it's a incredibly brightly coloured lobster. It's a bright blue and called cotton candy blue. The mutation that leads to it is considered 1 in a million. In fact, it's not even 1 in a million. It's 1 in 100 million. That's how rare it is. What makes them rare is reasonably straightforward. It's natural selection. The incredibly brightly coloured and very attractive looking lobster also looks incredibly delicious. And it's very obviously delicious, meaning any predator can come across, snatch it up and make it into its own dinner. It's why humans, given how we have to catch them, rarely if ever see them. Shifting to a different animal, we have the Komodo dragon, and they are increasingly living up to their name. They are giant reptiles that can reproduce without the assistance of another, let's say, through a process known as parthenogenesis. They're also able to make what is considered a venom in their mouth through the incredible cocktail of nasty bacteria they're in. And now we find something else in their mouth. Teeth. Now, the teeth should be obvious, but it's what's on the teeth that is important. The fact is, there is metal growing on those teeth, and that metal ensures that they remain sharp and functional for a very long time. Sadly, this is not going to be Mechagodzilla just yet, but it is getting to that point where deposits of iron along the edges of the teeth allow them to more effectively form serrations and therefore tear. This is great for the Komodo dragon, and not so much for whatever it catches. The teeth are so heavily deposited with iron that it actually starts turning a ridgeline orangey red from the sheer amount of iron that is present. This is a lot for what it is. Understand, we're talking about something that should be mostly made up of something like enamel, and therefore protected that way. The fact that there's this much, and it seems to be fairly common, tells us that doing so has a big advantage in terms of evolution, and possibly tells us something about what's going on with dinosaurs back in the day. The next news item we have for you is going to nature, but it's what man's doing to nature. Researchers from the Max Planck Institute of Plant Breeding Research in Cologne, Germany, have made a tomato plant that contains the complete genome of both of the parents that gave rise to it. This is not what should be happening, and it's certainly not natural by any stretch of the imagination. What should happen is you get a mixture of the two parents' DNA, and from this you get one genome, and not two. And the way they're doing it is that they've cloned eggs from each of the parents, and then allowed them to be merged together, creating a plant? Frankenstein monster? Yeah, that one sounds more right. That has both lines of the parent's DNA present. Why this is important is that, technically speaking, you can breed two different plants together and create a hybrid. These are great for that particular crop or that particular season, but you can't really save the seeds from it, because once you go through the process of harvesting the seeds from that particular hybrid, you may not be getting the same thing that you planted originally, whether it's down to mutations, crossbreeding, and so on. There are all sorts of things that can mess up your particular hybrid and lead to something weird. Oftentimes, it's not even that you get the beneficial parts of it, you'll get throwbacks to previous things that have been crossbred. Doing it this way, however, you do theoretically get the benefits of both, as you can get both beneficial traits from the parents, and they'll be expressed, let's say, and theoretically, as long as the cell line is stable, will continue to be co-expressed. The other benefit to this is that rather than relying on meiosis, that is the production of your sex cells for all intents and purposes, they relied on mitosis. And mitosis is just regular cell division, and this allowed them to avoid the issue of having to worry about getting new seeds, as the seeds require meiosis. They are the effectively babies of a plant. Theoretically, this would also allow them to grow hybrids, well, hybrids of a kind anyway, without having to worry about crossbreeding two distinct plant lines, so long as they have one single stable plant line that they can modify using their method. Going from the cutting edge of agricultural news to, well, what is current, but an attempt to go back in time. What happened in Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka had the brilliant idea of trying to go all organic. It's like somebody thinking that they'll just start shopping at Whole Foods from now on, and realizing very quickly that they run out of money, they can't pay their rent, they can't pay their bills, they can't do anything because they've spent all of their money on food, and they're still starving. And that's what happened with Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka not only went broke, but can't feed themselves, because of this colossal screw-up. The sad and frustrating part is that farmers didn't even have a choice. It was a government-mandated, let's say, decision, and more clearly direction, that required them to legally go all organic. This of course had Vandana Shiva absolutely ecstatic, until she realized that this looked really bad for her, and suddenly she hasn't brought it up again since. Or at least not in this way. The fact that the Sri Lankan farmers can't afford to feed themselves, often can't sell their food at a decent price, and there's widespread famine as a result, probably doesn't look great for a woman who charges an absolute fortune just to speak nonsense at various events. But that's just a theory. In other food-related news, we have the bizarre phenomena in which fast food retail outlets, McDonald's and similar, are offering fast food offers, and this is in an attempt to get the mythical wider market share, the otherwise known as the mythical wider audience. Just like the mythical wider audience, it's not working. There are a few reasons for this. The first is simply that people are less interested, people aren't able to afford it because, again, trying to pay for things that they need to pay for before eating out, and of course, it's not really food. Well, some of them are actually selling food, but most of them are selling something that vaguely resembles food but doesn't have much in the way of substance. Weird, since they are making money hand over hand each year until last year, where they finally saw the first reduction and arguably slight loss in their income, or at least compared to the previous year, for the first time in decades. Going from food to robots now, and the news that Tesla will be using humanoid robots, and questions as to what exactly they're getting up to. The reality is that humanoid robots can be useful in all kinds of ways, and this would be why they're looking at using it for low production Tesla models, primarily internal use models. The idea is simple. A humanoid figure is going to be able to work in a car somewhat more comfortably, simply because the car is made for a human. Now, is the car made to be assembled by a human? Different story. But so long as the robot can work with all the required parts, whether that is having its fingers in different ways, having socket wrenches for fingers, having a interchangeable hand that can go from, well, a hand obviously, to some sort of power tool and so on. It does make a lot of sense. And there is also the arguable idea that once you build a robot, it's fairly straightforward to replace your workforce with robots. You build it, or you buy it as needed, and that's it. There is no more investment other than the power to run it. You don't need to worry about wages, sick leave, health insurance, anything really. And of course, work health and safety doesn't really factor in as much, meaning those pesky OSHA inspectors don't have as much ground to complain at you that, oh, your tools don't have safety guards. Why is that person doing that? Oh, why is there a child sleeping under the loom? No, wait, no, that's the wrong century. Still, that could well be why. The final possible reason, and this one is far more, let's call it, questionable, is the idea that by having these robots being deployed in the factory to start with, they might be applicable in the establishment of a colony on something like Mars. Building a car is somewhat similar to building a, well, in this case, a space base, and so designing them and building them now gives him a head start in developing and deploying them for his Mars colony. In other space-related news, we have the plan to rescue the stranded but not stranded astronauts. Currently on the ISS there are 2 astronauts who NASA and Boeing both absolutely insist will not be stranded, that they're being rescued, that everything is fine, it's just taking longer than planned. Astronauts Bush Wilmore and Sonny Williams might disagree given how long they've been there. They sent up there on the 5th of June, and they're meant to return not much later. This is obviously now August, and they are still there. So 2 months does seem to fit the bill of being stranded, but NASA is insisting that no, it will just take time to return them to Earth. Yes, and Robinson Crusoe would say the same thing. Obviously, since we've just mentioned SpaceX, there is a very clear backup plan, but NASA has been very loath to actually mention the name, probably to avoid embarrassing Boeing, but unfortunately it's increasingly obvious that they're probably going to have to do so, and the next launch from SpaceX won't be until September. This means that they're going to be up there for another 2 months. That does, however, give Boeing time to get their shit sorted and actually rescue them themselves. And next we go to academia, and what's being put forward as a culture of fraud by Palladium. This is not necessarily an incorrect position to hold, particularly as we mentioned issues around things like outright plagiarizing people's theses and presenting them as original work. In other cases, it's been far more obvious problems around quite literally taking a published article, rewriting it just a little bit, and remaking the figures. Not remaking them as in different, but just remaking them so they look the same, just slightly tweaked. It's the epitome of, can I copy your homework? Sure, just don't make it too obvious. Except it was obvious. This is all driven by a three-pronged problem. One is the publish or perish mantra of academia. That is, you must publish research. If you don't, you're likely to find yourself fired. The second is funding, which is nearly always contingent on that first point of publishing. The third, which feeds into the other two, is getting results. And you nearly always need to find positive results. Because if you're doing a study and your results say that what you found isn't supporting your thesis or your hypothesis, you're likely to sit there and go, I've just wasted my life. Well, a large part thereof. And that means you're less likely to get grant money, and you're unlikely to publish your findings, which then has this vicious effect on everything else and creates a very nasty cycle. So, how do you solve this problem? You make it up. Well, not quite, but also yes. If you're not going to make up your results wholesale, instead you start tweaking images. Oh, you didn't include the whole image you took, just a section to show you what it was really like, despite that one section looking nothing like everything else. Or, alternatively, you just happen to accidentally repeat an image multiple times. Or the postgraduate who doesn't work in your laboratory anymore was responsible, and so on. Which obviously is a problem, because it's not just weird, but it is fraud. And therein lies the misconduct problem. And that misconduct problem then leads to all sorts of other issues. As the article explains, to an extent, there are no real ramifications for fraud. Now, to be clear, there are consequences, just that they don't really have much in the way of harm to the academics in the long term. For example, one of the more famous studies got itself retracted. The primary author didn't want it, but all the other contributing authors did, so eventually it was pulled, but that's the end of it. And given it had already been extensively cited, it's not like this is going to be much of a black mark. The university might investigate, but ultimately they probably won't do anything to the academic. They'll probably sanction them to some extent, which is a slap on the wrist, but again, it won't really harm their career. Most of them are already at the point in their career where you can't actually do much to harm them, other than outright fire them, and even that may not work. And this is often down to things like politics. It's much easier to just say, you did a bad thing, here, slap on the wrist, now go on your way and keep making us money. More so if they attribute the blame to somebody who's no longer present. For example, the theoretical graduate student we mentioned earlier, who's now no longer involved. Well, they're gone and they can't do any more harm, so why would we chase them? Or why would we chase this problem anyway? All we're going to do is dig up more dead bodies that we don't want to deal with. And this isn't just a one-off problem, nor is it in any one particular field. Sure, some fields are more problematic than others, but most, if not all, research has at least some kind of issue. It may not necessarily be the most obvious problem, but nearly every area does. In psychology, you just can't replicate results. In biological and biomedical research, you often can't rely on the results as they're shown, and in other fields again. Therein lies the problem. The nature of academia at the moment contributes extensively to fraud. As the article explains, the only real way to keep on top of this is literally people who are spending their time combing through these publications, looking for the indicators and then further delving into it to identify if those indicators actually point to legitimate problems from published research. The nature of research itself has also led to other problems, and we can see the issue of fraud most pronounced in creationism and research claiming that it supports the idea that God created the world about 6,000 years ago. You know, the whole, and God said, let there be light? Yeah. The problem is there was already light at that point, and God didn't actually speak or create words until much later, so we have an issue around what's actually happening logically. Despite the whole massive hole in the logic of creationism, there's a growing amount of, belief in it, or at least support, according to a Gallup poll. That's a really big worry. Since 1982, there's been fairly solid evidence, and yet since 1982, there's only been a slight drop in the belief in creationism. It's gone from somewhere around 50% to 37%. Considering that's over 40 years, a drop in 8% is not significant. The only good sign to come out of this is that over that same time, most creationists have finally recognized that God did not create species as they are, but that there is evolution. Which is amazing, that they can recognize both things at the same time, given how bonkers having both beliefs held simultaneously is. Despite that positive and very thin silver lining, it still shows that there's an uncomfortable amount of belief in creationism. The Neurologica blog goes through this in a great deal more detail and is definitely worth a read to see just what's happening, mostly because it shows that humanity is both simultaneously really dumb and really smart. In an example of really dumb and somewhat smart, we have the political drama around a Taylor Swift concert and the planned attack. Now, the attack is, stupid on multiple levels. The first and simplest is that Taylor Swift is somebody who has an incredibly, if not insanely, fanatical fan base. You are basically going to go into one of their sacred places at a sacred time and start pissing them off. When this happens, you get the same thing that happens when you piss off any religious group. They're going to turn around violently and suddenly, particularly when their glorious leader, so to say, is perceived to be in some kind of danger. They're going to be all the more keen to stop that danger from spreading. The second reason, this is the same group of individuals who can be mistaken for an earthquake on seismic detectors. That's how much force they can exert, and again, you're going to piss them off. This is the epitome of poking a hornet's nest, except rather than poking it, you're shoving your dick in there, and as you can imagine, that's not only going to end painfully, but badly. Fortunately, the Vienna concert is safe now, as the police arrested the teens, but that's not the point. The point is, it was incredibly dumb. The final irony in all this is that at least one of them appears that they may be from the area around Kosovo, the same area that triggered World War I. Yeah, that shows that humanity doesn't learn its lessons very well. The final news item we have for you is a further iteration of not only how stupid humanity is, but, well, that we don't learn our lessons. A Vietnamese man has had to have a 2-foot-long eel removed from his rectum after it began chewing through his intestines, because he inserted it into his anus.
I should go.
You think it's going to come out on its own? Are we talking bigger than a bread basket? Because actually it will come out on its own. Which for small stuff is no problem. It's wrapped up in a nice soft package and plop. Big stuff. You're going to rip something. Which, speaking medically, is when the fun stops.
How did you...
You've been here half an hour, you haven't sat down. That tells me its location. You haven't told me what it is. That tells me it's humiliating. You have a little birdie carved under your arm. It tells me you have a high tolerance for humiliation. So I figure it's not hemorrhoids. I've been a doctor 20 years. You're not going to surprise me.
It's an MP3 player.
Is it because of the size or the shape? Or is it the pounding bass line?
What are we gonna do?
Humanity is doomed. The surgeons had to remove the eel and save the man's life because he had put it so far up his butt that it was now part of his colon. And this is not the weirdest part of everything so far. The weirdest part is that he didn't just put the eel up his anus. He put the eel up his anus following a lemon. Now, what it is about a lemon, or a lime possibly, depending on how you look at the image, and an eel that follows it, we don't know. This is not like tequila shots. You can't just take tequila, lemon, and an eel up your ass. You generally go tequila, lemon, salt, or variations thereof. Perhaps it was something about the eel. It was about 2 feet, or 60 centimeters, and about 4 inches, or 10 centimeters in diameter. However, the fact it began chewing through his colon probably took away the brief period of joy he had. Where things get really disturbing for Vietnam is that this is not the first case of butt eels this year. To reiterate, that's this year, and apparently it's a fairly well understood phenomena. The difference, at least, is somewhat in that the other eel was only 12 inches or 1 foot in length. Maybe it's just not well endowed. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.